Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to Midnight Nightmare, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the tale. But before that, please consider giving us a like. Our next tale comes to us from Reddit user Throwinaway 1999. The author recounts a horrifying experience from a road trip they went on with their mom. Here's what they wrote. I'll do my best to explain what I saw, but it's difficult to paint an exact picture. I was driving across the country with my mom. We had just entered California from Arizona a little before 11 p.m. It was a rural area and there were other cars around, but I definitely wouldn't call it traffic. I'm driving and a bit off the road on the right side. At ground level, I see something glowing. It's a fluorescent neon, but dark blue. Very bright. But it didn't light up anything around it. It was just glowing. It was shaped like some kind of energy cell-looking thing out of a futuristic movie or video game. Probably 5 feet tall and 2 feet wide, with ribbed sides. I then realized that this thing was moving, and moving very weirdly. It was moving like it was glued to the ground and tracing the slightly hilly terrain, like it was on top of some kind of off-roading vehicle that was magnetically held down to the terrain that it was driving on. After a few seconds, it goes up a little, and then it disappears into the ground. Then we see these 2 small spotlights pointing from the air down to where it disappeared. They were moving really quickly, like the ones that you see when there's some kind of event in an arena in your city, but the light didn't reach up super far. These spotlights were encased by some kind of light dome and couldn't shine past it. The light was just stopped in its tracks instead of fading out into the sky. The dome was all lit up. It looked like there was fog inside of it, but not exactly fog. I could still see these 2 spotlights shining around in it, sporadically, because they were shining brighter than the rest of the dome. Keep in mind that I could not see anything else as it was really dark. I couldn't see the ground or the surroundings. I drove past it, speaking with my mom, trying to figure out what the heck we had just seen. All of it looked so extremely unnatural. Literally 5 seconds of driving later, my mom screams, "What's that?" I never ended up seeing what she was talking about, but she described basically what the internet says are stickmen on the left side of the road. It was the opposite side of the road from where we'd seen the neon light dome thing, and about 5 seconds of doing about 65 miles per hour as far as distance from the dome. She said they were about 12 feet tall, built like stick figures or on stilts, and she couldn't discern ahead. I saw another post somewhere that described how they walked in the same way my mom had said, like lullaping, or had kind of a bounce or waddle in their steps. At first there was only one walking, then another appeared close to it, and they were going toward each other. I punched the gas and got out of there because screw that. I didn't think quick enough to take a video of the light dome blue thing, but I'm glad I didn't, because for some reason I feel like we wouldn't have gotten off that easy for having footage like that. I'm not sure why I can't shake the theory that this blue light has to do with the government or something, but I don't know anything. I'll also mention that we saw flashing things in the sky pretty far away, moving too close to each other to be a normal aircraft. I've written that off as Border Patrol drones, but mostly just to put myself at ease. The next story is the account of a Redditor who saw something very strange in a tree on their property. Here's the tale. At the time, my house was situated perpendicular to a wooded area. It was just a normal, lazy summer day. I stepped onto the porch to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. I glanced over toward the tree line and immediately noticed a black silhouette of what appeared to be a man. My eyes are deceiving me, or so I thought. 30 feet in the canopy of an old oak tree, he sat. I was perplexed. At that height, the branches couldn't bear the weight of a squirrel. He was kneeling down, one arm above his head, grasping the branch above him as if to balance himself. Solid black, no defining features whatsoever. It was just a solid black mass, but no doubt it was a man. I was fixated. As I stared at him, I could tell that he was staring right back at me. I could feel it. We stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. Then, suddenly, he stood up and started running, jumping from tree to tree. Eventually, my house obstructed my view, so I gave chase, but to no avail. As I rounded the corner, he was gone. I ran to the trees but could see nothing, except swaying branches on a calm summer afternoon with no wind. That was roughly 25 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I suppose you don't really forget an experience like that. I had never really given much thought to the paranormal or the otherworldly before that. Or after, really. It wasn't until about 10 years later, as I was flipping through the channels, that I stumbled across a documentary about shadow people. And I knew immediately that that's what I had witnessed so long ago. In 1964, I was a firefighter and medic. What I encountered during one particular call has never left me. I responded to a house fire with someone entrapped on the second floor. It sounded like a lady screaming, but when we went up there, we couldn't find her anywhere. This is my story. Visibility in a fire is pretty awful, so finding people inside can be difficult. We spent about 20 minutes looking before a command ordered us to abandon the search. It was pretty disheartening because we knew somebody was there, and we knew that we were basically leaving them to die. When we got out, we wanted to know why we were ordered to stop the search, and we were told it was because there was never anybody there in the first place. Everybody was accounted for. I argued that the information they had must have been incorrect because I heard a lady screaming up there. By this point, the fire had been knocked down, and we went back to ventilate and look for a body, but we never found one. We overhauled for 2 hours, but there was no trace of anyone else in the building, and everyone was still accounted for. I still have no idea what happened. When she was just 11 years old, Reddit user SimpleLeaf96396's dad rebuilt their home. However, brand new as it was, he didn't stop something uninvited from checking out her new bedroom. Here's the story. I grew up as an only child. My parents had my sister when I was 11. Before she was born, my dad rebuilt our bungalow into a huge 2-story house. Hence, no one had died in my new bedroom. I'm in my mid-20s now, but when I was around 7, I started getting a lot of nightmares about the concept of death. I would wake up in the middle of the night crying for weeks on end, and then it would stop for a while before starting up again. By the age of 10, this developed into a feeling of being watched, being unable to sleep, and being convinced that something, not someone but something, was watching me from a specific corner of my room. My new room, the one that my dad had built. My dad eventually ripped that section of wall out to show me that there was a space there. I don't remember why, but there was a space all the way around the upstairs. He had tried to turn it into a fun den area for me, but I hated it, and I wouldn't go in there. This continued until I was about 12, when I got my first smartphone. The iPhone was my dad's old one, but it worked just fine. That was until it got dark outside, and the phone would start typing random letters when I was texting or typing to someone. This only ever happened in my bedroom. As soon as I would go out of the room, it stopped. I told my dad, and he said that it must be damaged, and he bought me a new one for my 13th birthday. He believes in ghosts, but he couldn't explain what was happening in that room that he had built. The new phone did the same thing. I thought I was going mad. I bought some spell candles from a witchcraft museum when we went on holiday. I was about 14. I used them to politely ask whoever or whatever was there to please leave the house peacefully. This seemed to work, and I was perfectly okay in that room again. I slept fine, My phones were all fine as I upgraded and got new ones, and I moved out when I was 20. I went to visit my parents and stayed the night in my old room. Whatever was there when I was a child is back. That same corner, that same feeling, the same dark energy, the same creature. Except now I have an image of it burned into my memory despite never actually seeing it. It's a dark creature. It has some type of human shape but very muscular, and it crawls around on all fours, legs bent behind it. Almost wolfish but without a snoot. It snarls and glares, dark red eyes with big black pupils, and it has horns as well. Big horns curved back over its head. There's some type of red tinge to it, but I can't identify where it comes from. But there you go. That's my story. Believe me or don't, it doesn't matter to me. But I don't go into that room anymore when I see my parents, not even in the daytime. My parents recently bought a farm last year in Australia and have been building a property on it for their retirement. It's right beside a national park and reasonably close to the next property over. The only thing that sucks is that we have no cell service besides the top paddock where they're building their house. Not too dodgy, right? Well, I'm a university student, 21-year-old female in my second year of nursing, and I frequently come up to the farm to help them out with their livestock and whatnot. At first, everything was fine. We had a small 2-bedroom cabin in the lower paddock that I stayed in every time I came up. My room had a large window that faced the national park, and at night, when it was pitch black, it would really freak me out a bit. But nothing serious. Sure, we had the usual noises of foxes and livestock at nighttime, but nothing out of the ordinary. Things really ramped up when I had to stay there alone to feed the livestock for a few days while my parents were back in the city. I went about the usual chores, feeding the sheep, keeping an eye on our lambs, and checking in at the building site to keep an eye on everything. I went into town to get some dinner at the local pub, and by the time I got home it was roughly 10 p.m. I would usually take my car up to the top paddock at night to call my friends, check social media, and so on. My car was lit up by internal navigation systems, which meant that I couldn't really see outside the car, besides whatever my headlights lit up. I was midway through my social media scrolling when I thought I saw something black flash across the paddocks where my headlights were facing. I drove my car in a quick circle to use my car's headlights as a massive torch, but I didn't see anything. No reflections of cattle's eyes like I normally do, or the usual fox or rabbit. There was nothing. I tried not to pay too much attention to it, and I went back to my social media scroll until I accidentally pressed my brakes, which allowed my brake lights to flood the paddock behind my car with an eerie red light. The same black flash that I had seen through my front windshield flickered out of the corner of my eye in the rearview mirror. Now I was suspicious. I turned off the music I'd been listening to and just sat for a second, trying to assure myself I was just tired. After a few seconds of silence, I was relieved and was about to turn my car on to go back to the cabin. And that's when I heard what I can only describe as claws on my rear windshield. Tap, tap, scratch. I have never sped as fast as I did back to the cabin that night. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of something watching me from the forest. You know that sort of tingling sensation of something staring into the back of your head? After tossing and turning, I put up a newspaper in front of my window, the one that faces the woods, until it was completely covered. The feeling immediately went away. Still, it's safe to say that sleep did not come easily. The following night, I chose to go to the top paddock while it was still reasonably light. All was pretty peaceful, and I had all but forgotten about the previous night's events. I was admiring the gorgeous pink sunset when I saw a flash of green in the sky travel for a split second and then disappear. Now listen, I'm not one for UFOs, but I know it wasn't a helicopter because it was light enough to see the sky and the stars weren't even out yet. I thought it was cool, so I called one of my friends, who's a massive skeptic about everything paranormal. Of course, she thought I was nuts and proceeded to give me crap for it. It started to get a bit dark for my liking, so I went back to the cabin and cooked some dinner. All was fine until I went to sleep, the newspaper from the night before still clinging to my window. I woke up at around 2 a.m. to a sound. I went to take a look on foot with my spotlight. Now, usually, when you bring a very bright light and irritate the sheep who were already going nuts, you hear about it. Keyword being usually. I walked over to the paddock and started scanning with my spotlight, and I didn't see anything. But the sheep were bleeding like crazy, but none were injured or even remotely in a corner of the paddock, huddled together like they usually do when there's a fox or a predator. That was until they all went silent. 1 second they were so loud that they echoed around the hills, and the next it was dead silent. Now I was truly scared. I raised my rifle and started looking around. I left first thing in the morning without even looking to see if there were footprints or anything else. If anyone has any clue what's going on or what this thing is and can tell me what I can do, let me know, because I haven't been able to go back to my parents' farm ever since. I was just thinking of an experience I had one weekend this past summer. I've had many extremely dark paranormal experiences, but this wasn't one of them. It was still emotionally intense and profound in its own way, though. I was at an outdoor music festival in Virginia in the United States. It was on an old farm. The property was huge, with big rolling fields and a few various small buildings littered about. After that evening's show got called off due to threatening electrical storms and crazy strong wind, I started walking across a field toward a little old shack set back among a few trees. The setting was surreal, like out of a movie. The sky was swirling and churning with dark, gray-black clouds. The wind was strong, but felt very refreshing after a hot, sunny, sweaty day. The electricity in the air was palpable. Everything felt slightly charged. As I started walking into the middle of the field, suddenly everybody was gone. I couldn't see or hear a single person from the festival. I kept walking across the field to the shack, and I was feeling very heavy, emotionally. There was a definite presence, not malevolent, but heavy. When I got to the shack, I collapsed on my knees, and I began weeping and apologizing repeatedly. This went on probably for a few minutes, but it felt like it was happening outside of time. It felt to me at this point like I was addressing formerly enslaved people who had lived and worked on the property. It was like they were all around me. Eventually, I stood up. I felt pleasantly exhausted after a big emotional release. I still hadn't seen or heard anyone from the festival since I had first walked away from them. I began walking back slowly toward the field where my car was, and the rain started pouring down. I soaked it all in as I walked back to my car. That night, after it became clear that the storm was going to prevent any further music from happening, I drove back to my motel room in heavy rain. I was awake in bed at 3 a.m. or so when I heard a creaking noise that turned out to be the mini fridge door slowly opening. I got up to check it out. I thought maybe the magnet on the mini fridge was weak, but it wasn't. It was very strong. There was no way this thing opened on its own, so I knew that something was there with me. I wasn't quite confident yet in my ability to assess the situation accurately on the spot, so I was feeling a bit leery and self-protective. But as some time went by, I grew more relaxed, and I sensed that the spirit was not malevolent. I sensed that she was a female spirit of a formerly enslaved person who had followed me back to my motel room. The energy in the room wasn't dark or ominous. It was like a mixture of sorrow, exhaustion, curiosity, and relief. I looked up the history of the property that the festival was being held at, and I confirmed that the property had been home to many enslaved people in the 18th and 19th centuries. I found myself wishing that I had been more comforting and explicitly accepting of her during those first few hours. I hope she was able to pass on after our encounter. In a way, I feel like she followed me back from the farm before she chose to pass on because I was a curiosity to her. Or maybe because I had shown kindness. Something that makes this experience stand out to me is that I rarely encounter human spirits like this. Mostly, I only encounter human spirits remotely through other people. My immediate radius is always so full of other non-human entities that I think most human spirits just steer clear. But there are a few things about the way this encounter unfolded that I think allowed for it to happen as it did. I had driven 12 hours to get there on the previous day, so there wasn't the usual residual dark energy just hanging around from the get-go. I also feel like the intense, swirling electrical wind and rainstorms that surrounded the festival for multiple days created a unique situation energetically. Either way, it was an emotional experience, and it felt cleansing. I live in North Dakota, in cattle country. In 2019, my grandpa passed away in the old farmhouse, which was the homestead for multiple generations. He died of side. It came out of nowhere and took everybody by shock. He was a very stubborn, independent man, so I just assumed that he preferred to die his own way, as opposed to being sent to some kind of old-age home. He was also known to drink heavily from time to time. My father and I found him in his rocking chair with the gun on his lap. Since then, there have been a run of odd events happening in and around the farmhouse and yard. Early on, it was just little things, doors opening that shouldn't be, unexplainable sounds in other parts of the house when nobody was there. One time, I thought I saw my grandpa in the mirror behind me. Overall creepy vibes, generic haunting stuff. I inherited the yard. It's been vacant since my grandpa's death. I was excited to fix it up and start fresh. One day, I was in the tree line cleaning up dead trees when I heard 3 distinct gunshots, like shots that seemed 50 yards away. I literally hit the ground. After a while, I got up, but there was no one around. About 10 minutes later, an old friend of my grandpa's drove into the yard. I had known him for years. He pulled up and I asked him if he knew who'd been shooting. He said it wasn't him and that he saw nobody around. He didn't seem himself. He was usually a happy guy, but on this day he seemed distracted, like he was in a fog. He said, "Are you sure you should live here?" I said yes, that I was excited to rebrand the yard. Not long after that, he left. About a month later, he died of a stroke. The day following the gunshots, my daughter, who was 5 at the time, and I were in the old house. She was playing with a toy train while I was cleaning. She abruptly stood up and said, "I want to go home." I followed her out of the house and helped her into my truck. She asked me if I could go get her train. When I went back into the house, it was like walking into a different universe. It was freezing cold. I could see my own breath. The house was the same, but the colors were different, almost muted. I was freaked out and left the house too. When I left, I heard thumping on the walls and siding of the house. Freaky stuff. I got in my truck and sped out. When we were a couple of miles away, I stopped and I asked my daughter what she had seen. She said that she saw a man with a pointy hat in the house. She hasn't been allowed in the yard since. I returned later that night. Stupid, I know. And I took pictures of the house. And when I looked at them later, there appeared to be a shadow figure with a pointed hat looking at me. I could only see it in pictures, though, not in real time. I met with a pastor, and he told me that what I was describing, the change in temperature, the muted colors, all tell of demonic activity. He agreed to pray and anoint and bless the house. When we went to the house, I was expecting fireworks, really, but nothing happened. In fact, it was calm and peaceful. I was optimistic that things were better. And they were, for some time. To clarify, the house is vacant, but my father and I still have cattle on the yard. And here are some of the things that have been happening over the past year. When I'm on the yard, I have unexplainable phantom pains in my left hand. Only when I'm on the yard and nowhere else, a stabbing pain in the palm of just my left hand. There was a large dead coyote in our shop, no evidence of how it got in there. One day, my dad drove into the yard and found our large bull trapped in a bale feeder. No explanation for that either. We found a cow dead with a broken neck in the corral. When I approached the carcass, my left hand began to throb. I could smell a unique scent, not associated with livestock. I've been around dead animals, but this was different. All of these things led me to tell my story. We've attempted spiritual intervention, and things just seem to be getting worse. I don't know what the significance of the pointed hat demon is. I know of the Hat Man, but this isn't linked to sleep paralysis at all. Can anyone explain the phantom pain in my left hand? What was the significance of the 3 gunshots? My grandpa was an avid hunter. Was this a warning from him? Honestly, any advice would be appreciated. Our next story was posted to r/paranormal by accomplished Rao 520. She tells the tale of what happened when she met a strange mourner at her great-aunt's funeral. Here's the story. Years ago, when my great-aunt passed, at her funeral, there was this old man. He was wearing a suit and he had a neck tattoo of an octopus. He had long hair and a ponytail. He kind of looked a little bit like Jack Welker from Breaking Bad. He started talking to me about my grandma and told me to take care of her and grandpa for a few minutes, then gave me $1 and asked me nicely to go to the vending machine and get him a water because he came to pay his respects and he had to keep going. He even knew my name, but I had never met him before and I hadn't given it to him. When I came back to give him the water bottle, I couldn't find him. I looked everywhere, and I even asked my grandparents if they had seen an older man around anywhere, and I described what he looked like. When we got home, my grandparents came over, and they were looking at family photo albums, and they saw the man that I described, the one that asked for a water, in the pictures. They yelled at me to come downstairs and showed me the picture and pointed to him. They asked if it was the man I had seen, and I said it was. He looked exactly the same. They told me that it was my great-aunt's ex-husband, Robert, who had been dead for 20 years. That's how he knew my name. He had died well before I was born, and like I said, I wasn't that close with my great-aunt, so I hadn't really heard about him. Either way, Robert had been dead for over 20 years. I didn't sleep for at least a week, maybe more. But the faces they made still send shivers down my spine. It was like they were watching somebody get killed in front of them when they heard about what happened to me and realized who it had been. They told me he was a good person, and he and my great-aunt regularly attended church and were just overall good people. I would say that I'm kind of religious, but I don't know. So, more than likely, he wasn't up to anything evil, I guess. I suppose he asked for the water so I would go away and he could disappear. He really loved his wife. I guess when he said he had to move on, it's because he had to take her to the next life or something. They asked me if I spent the $1, and I said I did. I kind of wonder what would have happened if I had kept it, or what happened to whoever wound up with it. Either way, it was a very unsettling and strange experience, if not kind of sweet.